Today on the Roundhouse, we're going to learn more about the Maine Two Footers, specifically by visiting the Wiscasset Waterville and Farmington Railway. All aboard!
In days past, the roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is The Roundhouse.
Welcome to the Roundhouse. I'm your host, Nick Ozarek, and this is episode number 116 of our Trains and Railroading podcast, where we're talking about everything in the industry and the hobby. You name it, and we discuss it. Today, we are talking to Stephen Piwowarski, the Director of Marketing and Visitor Interaction Coordinator, who is involved with this amazing little railway, a common carrier that was shut down and torn out in the 1930s, and then a group of volunteers came together to rebuild several miles of the line, rebuild and refurbish rolling stock, and today you go there and it's incredible to think that 40 years ago there was nothing, and now you see this thriving little line running its way through the woods of Maine. It is such a nifty place. We're going to learn more about that. Before we get to that, though, I have a very special announcement I want to share with you guys, and that is that I have founded a marketing company called Streamliner Media. I was working in marketing for full time, then COVID hit, and I was laid off and then terminated from my position. So I decided to take the leap, and now I do video work, photography, website, graphic design for a variety of clients, some of them railroad related, some of them not. You can see my work at streamlinermedia.com. As part of that, I have had questions in the past about my photos and where they're available and if they're available for print, and there hasn't been a central location to share them. Now there is. streamlinermedia.com/store. Photos available for print there. Some of them railroading related, some of them are not. Steam, diesel, a variety of subjects. We also have a few Wiscasset Waterville and Farmington Railway images on the store, which ties in nicely with today's episode. These are printed locally to where I live in Central Virginia, so I'm verifying the quality of the print. I'm signing them. I'm sending them to you. As a special deal for January and February 2022, I will offer you 5% off your first purchase from the store. The coupon code for that will be at the end of this episode. And my Patreon subscribers, I love you guys. On Patreon, you guys are going to get 15% off your order from a special code posted there. The web address to see these prints and place your order is streamlinermedia.com/store. Our guest today is the Director of Marketing and Visitor Interaction Coordinator for the Wiscasset Waterville and Farmington Railroad, located in rural Maine. Please welcome to the Roundhouse, Mr. Stephen Piwowarski.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be here. Hi, Nick. Thanks for having me on. And I look forward to talking with you tonight.
It should be very interesting to learn more about the 2-foot narrow gauge world of Maine. Before we get into the history of that, perhaps you could take us on a virtual tour of the Wiscasset Waterville and Farmington.
Historically, the Wiscasset Waterville and Farmington began in Wiscasset, Maine, which is right on the waterfront. It has a large harbor. And the railroad was literally where sea trade met land trade. The 2-foot gauge ran right out over the harbor and ran to a wharf where it would have transloaded directly from 2-foot gauge freight cars to ships. Probably the only railroad that I know of, at least in Maine, that did so in that way. speaking specifically to two-footers there. Um, Today, the railroad doesn't run all the way to Wiscasset. In fact, it hasn't since 1933. You'd have to drive about 10 minutes north of Wiscasset to the town of Alna and take a left turn onto Cross Road, where you'd motor down a little ways and find yourself sort of transported to another world, maybe another time. Um, Kind of leave the past, leave the future, or leave the present behind, and find yourself surrounded by this sort of surreal um, atmosphere, which is that of a 2 foot gauge common carrier railroad. Uh, when you come onto the property, you'd first see the turntable, the engine house, Sheepscot Station beyond, uh, with the freight shed on the main line. And then looking up the right of way, you'd see the water tank and all of the little pieces that make the 2 foot gauge hum, all the pieces that make everything work together. Probably the best way for me to describe the WW&F is in the way that I saw it first. I came from a world of standard gauge railway preservation before I ever came up here to Maine. And when I came over the last hill before pulling into the WW&F parking lot, I looked around and just said, "Whoa, this is something totally special." And the attention to detail was what struck me the most, and the attention to um, what I would say almost quality over quantity was really striking, because it wasn't the number of cars or the number of locomotives or how big things were that really struck me. It was that attention to detail that made the difference for me and kept me coming back.
In the US, I think we tend to categorize railroads by region or level them by the specific road names themselves. The Maine Two Footers is a whole other arena, because you're talking about a multitude of different railroads historically, but they all kind of end up in this category based on the fact that these were 2 foot gauge railroads. So perhaps you could talk a little bit more about historically what are the Maine Two Footers.
It's sort of a name that's rooted in irony, because the Maine Two Footers found their inspiration and their genesis actually outside of Maine. The first 2 footer that was really constructed in the United States, at least in the eastern United States, was the Billerica and Bedford, and that was in Massachusetts. So George Mansfield was the main sort of impetus behind the construction of the Billerica and Bedford. That railroad was very short-lived, and all the equipment from that railway wound up, after it closed, wound up finding its way north, along with George Mansfield, to Franklin County, Maine, where the Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes Railroad was founded. At that time, it was the Sandy River Railroad. It's a good time to point out that of all of the Maine two-footers, you have the Sandy River, later the Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes, the Bridgeton and Saco River, the Monson, the Wiscasset Waterville and Farmington, and lastly, the Kennebec Central. All five of these railroads were pretty different in what they did. The only unifying element to the railroads themselves was the gauge. Each one of them, much like standard gauge railroads, each one of them served their own purpose, served its own specific industries and its own locale. So the real unifying factor here is the gauge. Each one of them has a unique and fascinating story that's worth exploring in and of itself. And I would encourage anybody who has uh, an interest in railroads in general, or at least an interest in the two footer specifically, to really dive in and explore some of the resources relating to these five railroads.
The WW&F was one of these entities. It comes on the scene in the 1890s, despite being chartered decades before. It goes through reorganizations. It never quite matches the potential of what was envisioned for it, and then it gets ripped out in the 1930s, which makes it all the more impressive when, for nearly 50 years, this right-of-way, parts of it were redeveloped. A lot of it was just untouched right-of-way. But then comes along a person with an idea, let's just rebuild as much of it as we can.
Yeah, so that fellow's name was Harry Percival. And Harry grew up here in Maine. He grew up uh, in a variety of towns, actually, with connections to the railway. First in Weeks Mills, which was the junction of two different branches of the WW&F, the one we mentioned earlier to Albion, and then the other one, which went up to Winslow. And then he moved down here to Alna several years later, with his family settling in a house that's actually adjacent to the right of way. And his sort of boyhood dream was sort of seeing this railroad where the tracks had been torn up, but there were still buildings and cars remaining from it in various locations along the line. And seeing that and saying, yeah, I'm going to rebuild that someday. This was his really a childhood dream for him. And it took many years for it to come to fruition. Uh, he was growing up along the right of way in the late 1930s, early 1940s, and he sort of deferred that dream through his early adulthood until the 1980s, when he worked for Central Maine Power Company, and he heard through the grapevine from someone in like a right of way division within the company that, hey, Frank Winter, the last owner of the WW&F, he passed away, and the foundation, the Winter Foundation that was started to take care of his estate, they're starting to sell off some of the land, so you might want to watch out for that. And Harry Percival got in touch with the Winter Foundation and made them an offer for the land. Well, I shouldn't say the land, because that's not accurate. It's he made them an offer for the remaining assets of the WW&F Railroad, which at the time no one really knew what they were. It was whatever Frank Winter had bought from the company. So he made an offer for the remaining assets of the WW&F, and Harry, I guess, liked to say he never knew if it was too much or too little, if it was the right amount, but they accepted it. So he became the owner of the remaining assets of the WW&F. And to me, in particular, this is one of my favorite parts of the story, because he found out he got all this right of way, which is the thing he was really after, as since his goal was to rebuild the railroad, he was really after the right of way. But what he also got were the majority. He became the majority shareholder for the Wiscasset and Quebec Railroad Company, which he didn't know if it meant anything. Well, he approached the state of Maine, and asked them about this company. He'd like to start a new company called the Wiscasset and Quebec Railroad Company. And it turned out that that company had never been dissolved. It was never closed. So they told him he needed to go and find shareholders in the W&Q Railroad and basically hold a shareholders meeting. So that's what Harry did. And to this day, the Wiscasset and Quebec Railroad Company, the same company that was founded in 1854, uh, is the owner of the majority of the right of way. Not just that the WW&F operates on, but that extends all up and down the Sheepscot Valley.
Fascinating that it would still exist, but property ownership is such a tangled web in its own right. Then he's putting the land together. He's putting together a team of volunteers who are starting to relay track. There's so much rebuilding going on, and then perhaps the crown jewel comes back in the form of number 9, which I understand was in a garage or in a barn in Connecticut for a number of years, waiting for its time to return, essentially.
The whole story of the WW&F, and I think it's worth mentioning this, is it's sort of a story of almost couldn't have happened. Wow, that was lucky. Just the right thing at the right moment, type arrangements, and that's how it went. With the land ownership and everything else. The WW&F, after it had been purchased by Frank Winter, uh, was sort of in a motive power shortage. The ICC had come up and done a locomotive inspection, and everything was failing the inspection. Like there were functional locomotives, but not legally functional locomotives on the property. The two big new Baldwins that the railroad had bought in 1907, both had been burnt in a roundhouse fire in 1931, and they were struggling to keep things going. So Frank Winter came in and said, okay, I have an idea. The Kennebec Central, which is across land, sort of not that far away. It's only about 15 miles from the WW&F. He said, they're out of business. They're not running. They haven't been running for years. Let's buy their locomotives and keep our railroad running, because he had found out that the ICC had given those locomotives an extension. So he actually bought the entire Kennebec Central Railroad just for its 2 locomotives, scrapped most of the rail cars, and brought the engines over to the WW&F. Those are what became locomotives 8 and 9 on the WW&F. Number 9 ran here for about a month and a half before part of its rear truck frame broke and it went out of service. Number 8 then took over took over all of the trains because it was the only locomotive left. And then that was the locomotive that in June of 33 crashed and years later got scrapped on the spot. So that's how number 9 got saved there. It was the locomotive that broke down so it didn't derail. Then a few years pass. The locomotive is down in Wiscasset, sort of sitting, awaiting its fate. And a couple of rail fans come together, namely William Moneypenny. It's probably a somewhat familiar name. He has a pretty large photo collection, I think. There's a pretty large collection of his photos of steam locomotives out there. 1937 rolls around, and William Moneypenny and Frank Ramsdell kind of pool their resources and buy locomotive number 9 from the remains of the WW&F. And they put it on a flat car and have it shipped down to Connecticut with the idea of starting something not unlike the Edaville in South Carver, Massachusetts. That was sort of the concept. They would start a little railroad in the northeastern corner of Connecticut where they were located, a place called Thompson. And as it came to pass, they got the locomotive there, and they were pretty gung-ho about it for a little while. But pretty much everyone universally recognized at that point that the locomotive was pretty much totally clapped out. It had nothing, no redeeming qualities as far as its mechanical condition. And there wasn't a lot of impetus among the group of people who were working at that time to, not impetus. I think there was actually a lot of enthusiasm, but there wasn't the skill. So it got kind of put on the back burner, along with the fact that Frank Ramsdell was a farmer, and that's two jobs already right there. Restoring a steam locomotive on the side, there just wasn't time for it in his life. And he eventually passed away, and his daughter, Alice, came into the picture. She had loved playing on the locomotive as a girl and shared her father's passion for steam locomotives. And she inherited the house that they had lived in, along with the property and, of course, the locomotive. Well, Alice was very protective of the locomotive, and despite numerous inquiries, the locomotive sort of became a legend, especially in the Northeast. Oh, have you heard about the locomotive in the barn in Connecticut? Yeah. Well, have you heard about the person who won't let you get near it? Yeah. And there had been a couple offers. I believe F. Nelson Blount was someone who had approached with the good intention of finding a better home for the locomotive, but she was very protective of that engine right up until she passed away. And in fact, not just the locomotive, but all of the WW&F equipment, because it wasn't just the locomotive that went. There was also a boxcar and a flat car that went to Connecticut as well. And as she built a relationship with Harry Percival, so the founder of the museum here, as she built a relationship with Harry, I think she found somebody that she could trust. I think she found someone who saw eye to eye with her on a lot of things, and they had an understanding with each other, which the ultimate sort of that set the foundations for number 9 coming back. First, the flat car came back, and that was restored here. Then the box car came back, and that was restored. And I think that all of those steps along the way helped build trust that, yeah, number 9 can come back as well. And that was the final. I believe the locomotive came back in 1995, and there was about a 5-year period where we didn't do anything restoration-wise. It was more of an evaluation period. And then in 2000, restoration started in earnest, and it was a 15-year restoration to get the locomotive back in steam. And then it steamed for the first time in December of 2015.
That leaves you with an operating steam locomotive. You also, along the way, had purchased your number 10. And now, fast forward to 2021, when I finally get the opportunity to visit you guys up in Maine. And my first impression upon seeing everything and going out for a ride along the line is this is like a playground for Maine Two-Footers, because all of the other ones, the SR and RL, Kennebec Central, Monson, all gone. Everything was torn out. So this is the one place where you've got Maine Two-Footers literally roaming in the wild, and in an area that's not super highly developed. So I imagine that for you guys who are there on a regular basis, to be able to take in, first of all, the amount of work that's been done over the past 40 years to build everything anew from the little that remained back in the early 80s. And to take it in this idyllic setting is truly a special treat and a different side of rail preservation.
I'm biased to say that there's nowhere else like it. Um, but there is really nowhere else like it. Uh, the I've been so inspired by many of the other places I've been. I was so inspired when I visited the East Broad Top, of course. Uh, been inspired. No matter what, you go anywhere and you learn something, right? Um, but I'd say all of that has come back and sort of been formative, at least in my interpretation of my work here. When I look at other things, I say, "Oh yeah, that's great. Like let's bring that back. That's a cool idea." But it all sort of gets sifted down and comes through the filter of what is the WW&F? If we're going to introduce something new, it's going to be something new, but it's going to be done the WW&F way, whatever that means.
The Strasburg Railroad is an institution in the heritage railroad industry, and its mechanical services department is proud to lead the way. With the knowledge and experience that has created one of the most reliable steam railroading experiences in the country, the Strasburg Railroad is excited to offer their expertise to the rest of the industry. Strasburg's professional team provides consulting and technical assistance to take your steam locomotive or railcar project from idea to finished product. They stand behind their work and always strive to meet their customers' needs for quality, historic accuracy, and reliability at a price that is fair. Unlike many competitors, they feature a fully equipped boiler, railcar, and machine shop, so the work gets done in-house, helping you to get more for your money. Send your inquiries to mechanical@strasburgrailroad.com and let the professionals get to work for you. When I was attending in the summer, it was for your annual summer picnic event. And part of the highlight of that is the fact that you're operating multiple trains at once. And to go to any tourist railroad, and there's very few that could do this, to go to any one that I'm riding a steam-powered train and we get to the middle of the line and we're passing another steam-powered train is pretty nifty. And that was made possible because this summer you were running your own number 9, but also Bridgeton and Saco River number 7 and Monson Railroad number 3. And those two engines are owned by the Maine Narrow Gauge Railroad Museum based out of Portland. Louis Mariano asks, how did your partnership with Maine Narrow Gauge of Portland come about, and how have both groups benefited?
Our partnership with Maine Narrow Gauge sort of has its roots as one of mutual benefit. Both of us have strengths within our organization and also weaknesses. And by recognizing where each of our strengths lied, we were able to really come up with a nifty collaboration that really put the not either organization's um, own best interests at heart, but really put the equipment's best interests at heart, because that's really why we all exist. In at the end of the day, we don't exist for ourselves. Maine Narrow Gauge doesn't exist for themselves. We all exist to preserve this heritage of narrow gauge railroading in Maine and the equipment that helps tell that story. So it all came together a couple of years ago. Uh, at the time, Wes Hines, the executive director at Maine Narrow Gauge, and we sort of initiated conversations because it became very clear that Maine Narrow Gauge was going to lose their exhibition space in Portland um, due to the redevelopment along the waterfront. Uh, and we really saw this as a time to sort of work together, help them move their organization forward, and help preserve the equipment. So, in concert, we identified several pieces of equipment that were of undeniable historical significance that should have indoor storage, um, should have interpretation, and be also available for public viewing. Um, those among those pieces are included the Sandy River and Rangeley parlor car, the Rangeley, which is the only 2 foot gauge parlor car in the United States. You also have a Bridgeton Saco River caboose that I believe its number is 32, but it was numbered 111 at some point. Uh, Bridgeton Saco River Locomotive 7 and 8, which are the two remaining 244 Baldwins from the Bridgeton Saco River Railroad, and a host of other cars and equipment, mostly from the Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes and Bridgeton Saco River railroads. And what we did was sat down at the table with Maine Narrow Gauge and kind of figured out, okay, like this equipment needs to be stored inside. We have a car barn. It's not big enough. Maine Narrow Gauge really stepped up to the plate and made a significant uh, contribution that allowed us to extend our car barn and provide storage for more cars and also exhibition space. So that's sort of the nuts and bolts of like the physical plant. In the year following that collaboration, which is called it's called the Narrow Gauge Collection, the kind of host of everything together. In the year following, we built out that extension on the car barn, which gave space to store and exhibit that equipment. And we also, looked at flexible operating agreements for the pieces of equipment that could be operated, like locomotive number 7, like locomotive number 3, and like some of the cars, like the Rangeley or the Sandy River 14. Um, the partnership has been wonderful. I think that both organizations have really gained from it, not only in terms of um, like the physically tangible um, benefits for the equipment, which is what we were all seeking, but also from the relationships we've built across the organizations, the people that we've met. We've certainly been able to help them in a pinch many a time, and we see many of their volunteers here on a regular basis volunteering as well. So that sort of back and forth uh, in what's already a small community is so nice, and one of the really great parts of it.
It's clear you have so many different projects going on. The drive that you guys have is quite phenomenal when you look at the projects that you've completed even over just the past 5 years, as well as those that you're in the middle of some of your bigger campaigns. I want to start by looking at what are some of the recent triumphs that you've had, restoration or new construction.
Some of our most recent projects are actually outgrowths of that collaboration with Maine Narrow Gauge. Um, what the smaller of two Bridgeton and Saco River tank cars. There were two of them. The smaller of the two was completely restored. That car um, was very it was in very precarious condition and received a full ground up rebuild. that has, should by all accounts keep it going well into the next century. And not only is it great that we have this tank car preserve, but we use it, which is really handy. We don't use it for moving gasoline like the Bridgeton did back in the day, but we use it as a water tender further up the line when the steam locomotives need to rewater and don't want to come all the way back to Sheepscot to use the tank. Um, Now we also, in the process of reconciling their collection, Maine Narrow Gauge wound up donating a few boxcars that were in their collection, kind of surplus, because they were repetitive examples in their collection. But we had the need for them here, so we acquired Bridgeton Saco River number 67 and wrapped up a restoration of that car uh, a couple of years ago, though it's in the shop right now getting a final coat of paint. And Bridgeton Saco River boxcar number 56, which has the sort of unique history of being the only I believe it's one of the only main narrow gauge stock cars. Although it was built as a box car, it was used as a stock car for several years on the Bridgeton. That car is nearing the end of its restoration. It's getting sided right now. Um, Now, those are some of the close to completion rolling stock projects, but it's also important to remember that the WW&F had no physical plant essentially when it restarted in the 1980s. So, sort of in concert with all of these rolling stock restoration and construction projects, there have also been a ton of building projects. And perhaps the most impressive building projects that have taken place in the last couple of years are the completion of the turntable at Sheepscot, which is a Portland company design turntable. It's the same as the turntable that was located in Wiscasset. It's built to the same plans. And then the 3/4 of a mile extension of the railroad further north, that's been dubbed the Mountain Extension. Uh, it was the ruling southbound grade on the railroad, with grades in some places exceeding 4%, several reversing curves. It's a pretty gnarly piece of railroad engineering, and it's very indicative of what narrow gauge engineering was all about, which was to accomplish more using less material in smaller spaces, and still somehow get the train over the line. Um, it was an amazing feat to rebuild this section of railroad in the time span we did. We were given some uh, d- really challenging timeframes to work with. We started the work. Uh, it was based on a partnership that resulted in a donation of a bridge. It was a covered bridge that was originally on the Boston, Maine, and New Hampshire. That bridge was donated to us by the National Society for the Preservation of Covered Bridges. That bridge is at the essentially the end of the mountain extension, and that set the ball rolling for that entire section of the railroad being restored. Because it was sort of the unknown in the equation was how are we going to span this brook? The original design for the bridge didn't work anymore. And this bridge literally, through one of our members, kind of fell into our laps. And then the question of extending the railroad that next 3/4 of a mile was no longer a question. It was just a question of how long. And that extension is going to be opening next August at the annual picnic. So if you're interested in riding the full extent of the WW&F up to this point, come visit in August and you'll be able to ride to the end of the line.
Oh, that'll be fun. One of the projects I saw you guys working on. I think this was back in 2017 or 2018. You were doing some track work. I thought this was the coolest thing. You had actual draft horses towing a flat car collecting rail.
That was a very it was during a photo charter, and we were we were recreating um, a photograph that had been taken on the original railroad in the post closure period in the around 1937, when flat car 118 had been tied up to a team of draft horses, and they would go down the line collecting rail on the flat car for to scrap. Um, Now, of course, flat car 118 was the car that wound up being preserved. So when that was recreated, the very same car was being used to recreate those scenes. Interestingly, we were pulling up that rail so that we could do drainage work so that the railroad would last longer. And now that section of rail has been relaid and is in better condition than probably ever before.
Here we are in the winter 2021, looking ahead towards 2022 as of recording this. And you have so much opportunity with what you're embarking on project wise. And something that you've been working on for a while that's really cool is simultaneously finishing restoration of your number 10 locomotive, as well as building a completely new locomotive, number 11, from scratch. What is the goal with each of those, and where are those at right now?
Going back several years to 2015, when number 9 went into service, we took number 10 out of service to do some exploratory boiler surveying work. Uh, the other locomotives that had been reboilered by Edaville at the same time were all finding they were finding flaws in the boilers that were not being reconciled. So we looked at number 10's boiler, and certainly it had the same faults. And the realization was we could build a new boiler um, of better condition, of better quality, that would last longer rather than repairing the old boiler. In the case of number 10, it wasn't a historic locomotive to this railroad, and the boiler itself was not a historic boiler. It was built in, I believe, the late 1950s, not by the original builder of the locomotive, Vulcan. Or it was built by a secondary shop. So we realized an opportunity there, and in deciding to raise money for number 10's boiler, we also partnered that with another existing project, which had been gathering steam throughout the years, which was this project to build locomotive number 11. Um, Number 11, for those of you who haven't heard of it, is a recreation of WW&F's original number 7, which was Baldwin 244, was one of the larger locomotives to operate on the WW&F, built in 1907. So the 21 campaign came about as a way, very clever, to add 10 plus 11 equals 21, and raise money for the locomotive, for the boilers of both of these locomotives, which we did handily through the generous support of our donors over the scope of a couple of years. Raised the money to build these boilers. It sort of an unfortunate concurrence of having way too much on our plates at the same time. This was also right around the same time that the bridge for the mountain extension fell in our laps, and that project ramped up. So, in case folks are wondering why number 10 isn't done yet, it was because very pressing need to work within the timeline set for the mountain extension, which were outside of us. It mostly had to do with meeting federal permitting requirements and working within work windows. That's why that work got shifted forward, and number 10 got shifted to the side since we already have number 9 functioning. But number 10 actually is the work is ongoing right now, and there's a team of folks up here in Alna right now who are carrying forth work on the boiler, just trying to push that along. In addition to moving forward on the Build 11 project, which is the project I was mentioning before to complete this new steam locomotive for the WW&F.
Chris Eden Green asks, given the challenges faced by railway preservationists in the 2020s, where do you envision the WW&F going from here?
That's a good question. And certainly, given the state of railway preservation as we entered this sort of pandemic mindset, it's had an impact on all of our bottom lines. It's had an impact on our business models. I was shocked to learn last year in conversation with our treasurer. We were talking about what we did last year and how things panned out, and he said it's the best financial year we've ever had. We took a lot of steps early in the pandemic, very proactively, to anticipate different scenarios and basically took some steps that we probably would have taken anyway, but the pandemic sort of forced our hand. So we really moved away from a model of just operating trains for train's sake. We basically no longer offered just scheduled round trip passenger trains. And this was consistent with a model that we devised several years earlier, but hadn't really implemented yet, which is that the railroad doesn't exist. Essentially, no railroad exists just to take a train ride. That doesn't meet the qualification of being transportation. People take trains to go places, and then they happen to enjoy their journey along the way, which is what keeps them coming back. We realized that all of our trains should, in fact, go somewhere or go to something. And we found a really excellent partner up our railway in Sea Lion Farm, which is one of our closest neighbors at top of the mountain station. And they are a small scale farm that does a lot of vegetables and specialty crops. And they've really become an ideal partner in the sense that they have an eye towards agritourism, and we're able to support that in a unique way by providing people a really unique way of reaching their operation. So we've had pumpkin picking trains over the past year where people will ride the train to top of the mountain station, transfer to a horse-drawn wagon, ride up to the farm, go out into the pumpkin patch and pick, spend time at the farm, walk around, take a horse-drawn wagon ride, then come back and ride the train back to Sheepscot. We've done lavender picking trains with them. We partnered with them on steam and sleighs. Meanwhile, we're also offering concerts at a new open-air pavilion at Alna Center Station. And the possibilities are endless. We're just really interested in partnering with people and businesses along the right of way to create meaningful experiences for people. Maybe the best example, that's going to be coming up in the upcoming year is down the mountain at Trout Brook. The railroad passes through a nature preserve called Trout Brook Preserve. We've been partnering with the conservancy that runs that. It's called Midcoast Conservancy, and they've been offering guided hikes where the guide rides the train up with the people who are going to be hiking, takes them on a guided hike, explore some of the nature, like the flora and fauna of the area, and then takes the train back. And as we open up Trout Brook Station, we'll be doing even more of that.
It's so nifty to have the ability to travel on this and really feel like you're traveling to a place with a purpose. It gives so much life to the experience of it. And as you say, going beyond just I'm riding the train to ride the train. But this idea of I'm actually going someplace with it, and I'm getting different things, especially throughout the year. People who live locally can have reason to come back. Oh, I rode the train once. Yeah, but you didn't ride it to go pumpkin picking or experience the holidays.
Right. Yeah, it's all about providing an experience that changes with time, and also reaching not just one group of people, but a diverse group of people, and uh, providing all of these experiences. If you distill them down to their base element, they're providing context for what the railway is, because uh, understanding that the railway was transportation to get to something in the past, doing that in today's world provides context so that people can understand a broader meaning of what the role of the narrow gauge was at the turn of the century.
Especially the agricultural role of it.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, that is a key point that sort of it couldn't be supported by our mission any other way. Or rather, we couldn't support our mission any other way than just doing it. So now we're doing it, and for every reason, it feels like a great fit. And it's certainly been a boon to the railway in terms of ridership and finances and all of those things. That just, I think good ridership and good finances are like a good reflection that you're doing the right thing. that's that's not the aim, that's the result of the aim.
Good mentality to have towards that. Last question I have for you here, Stephen, is what do you enjoy most about your time at the WW&F?
It's certainly changed over time. It's always been the enthusiasm of the people that surround the place. It's probably the most enthusiastic group of people I've ever worked with. There are other words for that, but we'll call it enthusiasm. And the thing that I think as my own sort of role in the organization has matured, and the organization has matured, the fact that we're able to have hard conversations about meaningful things and come to effective compromises, and also make meaningful decisions that aren't just based on whims, but are like based on a whole host of cultural and historical precedents and values. Really, I think that's one of the things that really separates us, in some ways, from. We just have a very, very different. It seems like a very different mentality, because we're not simply preserving. It's very specific. We're preserving specifically the memory of the WW&F Railway. We don't have a very diverse focus. It's very pinpoint in that respect. And we look at everything that we do through that filter. And I think that intense focus sort of captivates me, perhaps.
It may be an intense focus, and yet what you're doing, I feel spiritually, does so much for Maine narrow gauge as a whole. The concept of the 2-footer, to have this 2-foot playground. Stephen, it's been so wonderful to have you on the podcast. Their website is WW&F.org. You can see what their upcoming experiences are. You can become a member and check out what they have going on throughout the year. Stephen, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. It was great to be with you, Nick.
And now, the question of the day.
Last time on the Roundhouse, we were talking to the developers of Railroads Online, the new train computer game that combines train simulation with business management, with track laying. Very interesting game. I've been having a lot of fun with it. I'm sure you guys are as well, at least some of you guys. And this led to the question, what do you love about train simulators or train-themed computer games? From Facebook, Jacob Massey writes, simulators are a nice outlet for those who want to enjoy a line that they aren't able to get to easily. And from YouTube, McCoach Railway Productions writes this, I work as a driver on a railway here in Germany, and one thing I know is the following. The top brass never manages to understand the problems that the men and women on the ground suffer, be it troublesome locomotive faults that never get fixed, or sidings and relief lines that have been closed for economic reasons that are now dearly missed, as they would like to take the pressure off from the main line that is currently overcrowded with services. So, whenever I play a railway-based video game, I can be in control. I am the one who is allowed to decide the number of sidings, what engines are used, and what types of services are running. And usually it all boils down to me never abolishing steam traction and still manage to keep making money, which for me is always a neat thing to have. Very interesting response there, McCoach. I've had real railroaders who aren't rail fans ask me, well, if you're doing train simming so much, why wouldn't you just get paid to do the thing real life? And I guess for me, I like the fact that I can separate the two, that I can operate trains when I want to, but also step away from it when I don't want to. And I know so many real railroaders who are also into train simulation as well. It's interesting to see the different attitudes towards it. Your question of the day for this episode is, what is your favorite narrow gauge railroad? Let me know on the roundhousepodcast.com, links to social media, and I bet some of you have been waiting for that coupon code. Go to streamlinermedia.com/store, and the link will be in the show notes as well. And you can check out photos, including some of the Wiscasset Waterville and Farmington, available for print. And that coupon code is OURHOUSE, OURHOUSE, all lowercase, because of course, the Roundhouse is our house.